Hello and welcome back to Tips and Time Savers. I'm Danny Rocks. I created today's lesson after helping a viewer to solve a problem. The viewer wrote asking for my help in a pivot table that he had created. He had taken information from mainframe computers in two different locations. Now, in this case, from location number one, the three fields are the invoice number, the amount of the invoice, and then the source. Notice that these are all positive numbers. From location number two, using a different mainframe computer, he still had the same three fields: the invoice number, the amount of the invoice number, and notice that these are all negative numbers. So in other words, he's going to be creating the pivot table to match up an offsetting debit and credit. Well, he did copy and paste for the values and came up with this combined mixed table. When he created his pivot table, he had problems because he was finding that he should have had invoices that had a credit and then an offsetting debit, or an offsetting credit for the debit, and that was not happening. Well, here's the source of the problem. So best practice number one: for a field such as invoice number, you're never going to be asked, well, what's the total value of these invoice numbers? You're going to want to do a count of the number of invoices, but never being asked to total the value of the actual numbers for the invoice. So we want to make sure that this field is formatted, that it's stored as text values. Remember that when we enter a numeric value into a cell in Excel, it is aligned to the right side of the cell. When we enter a text value, it aligns to the left. So we want to make sure that we format the entire column as text from the get-go, and that's the problem. So all right, let's see where the problem came in with the pivot table. So one cell selected, insert tab of the ribbon, pivot table, and I'm going to have the pivot table created on this worksheet. All right, let's take the field list. We'll take the invoice number, put that into the row. The amount will be the sum of the amount of the invoices, and let's take the source and put that over here into the column. All right, so over here for this invoice, we have a debit and a credit. For this invoice, we have a debit and a credit. So the reader said, well, for this invoice number, 68910, I know I have a credit for it, but it's not matching up. So here's the invoice, 67890. There's the debit, 67890 down here. Here's the credit. Why didn't they match up? Well, let's go back to the source. In this case, what we have for 68910, either by an error of omission, an error of commission, this is a number that's stored as text. It's aligned to the left side of the cell. In location number 2, 67890 was entered in numerically. So you see, we want to have consistency. We want to make sure that this column is stored and formatted as text. Now, let me import a field. Let me import a file. It's actually going to be this information that I exported. Now I'm going to import it. So I saved it as a text file. Resist the temptation to go Office button or File and then do Open. No, rather what we want to do is go to the Data tab of the ribbon, and over here in the Get External Data group, we want to get external data from a text file. So here is that information. Now we want to follow through the steps in the wizard. We've determined that we've used a delimiter, either a tab or a space or a comma, to delimit the fields. Now you'll know that you have the correct delimiter when you have these vertical separations between the fields. Notice if I clicked away from tab and put in comma, I don't get the correct delimiter. So it is going to be a tab that delimits. Now here's the gotcha step. What we want to do is we want to take a look over here at column A, the invoice. Now Excel is looking at the first 5 or 6 values and say, haha, they're numeric, that'll be fine in general. No, it won't. What we want to do right here at the beginning is bring it into our data as stored as a text value, not as a numeric value. So now when we import it, you'll notice that the invoice numbers are all stored as text. They align to the left side of the field. So now when we go in to create the pivot table, insert pivot table, and again I'm going to create a pivot table on this worksheet. Now let's do the same thing. We'll have the invoice numbers in the row, we'll have the source over here in the column, and we'll use the sum of the amount. So remember that invoice 67890? When I come down and I look for that invoice 67890, there you see I have the debit and the credit, because I made sure that the information came in stored and formatted as text. Now, just before I end the lesson, let me import another text file. So again, I'm going to go over here to the Data tab of the ribbon, get external data from a text file. In this case, I'm going to bring in an address book. Again, I'm going to follow the wizard. It's delimited. We've used the tab as the delimiter. We have the vertical lines indicating the fields. Now the gotcha step is going to be on the next step of the wizard. Over here, notice that we have a variety of formats for the date that it was added. We want to make sure that for the date that we've selected, is it going to be month, date, year, or is it going to be year, date, month? So MDY will mean month, date, year. The second gotcha is over here for the postal code. If I leave this as general data, what will happen is that the leading zeros, in other words for Boston, that leading zero in the postal code will disappear. Excel will consider it an insignificant digit. So I want to make sure that I bring postal codes in as text. Likewise for the phone number. They're all numeric values, but we're not going to total up the value of the numbers in there. So we want to bring in the phone number as text. In other words, anything that we're not going to do a sum of should be imported, should be stored as text. So now we have that leading zero stored as text properly, as opposed to making this entry 06325 and expecting to have it formatted correctly. General formatting deletes that leading zero. Text formatting keeps that initial zero in place. So there you've learned some tips for importing data from external sources. It's one of the tips that I offer on my DVD, the 50 Best Tips for Excel 2007, and I'll look for you in the next lesson.